Hello and welcome to Written Words, and today's video is going to be about translating a poem. I came to writing through translation. I'm a translator mainly from Russian and French into my native language, which is of course English. And as a translator, I am occasionally asked to translate poetry. But from time to time, I also do it just for fun. Poetry translation is, in my opinion, the ultimate challenge for a translator. Because not only do you have to translate the meaning, but you also need to translate the musicality and the beauty of the poem too. A translation of a poem should be a poem in its own right. But the process of translating a poem is also particularly rewarding. It's a way to dive more deeply into the poem itself, and it helps me to understand the poem better. I sometimes liken the process of translating poetry to doing a crossword, because it's not enough to just find words that mean the same thing. You have to find the right words that fit exactly into the right place in the poem. And hopefully, when you've finished, you end up with a whole new poem in your hands. So I sat down and I tried to work out what are the stages that I go through when I'm translating a poem. Other translators may have other ways of going about this, but this is my process for translating a poem. I worked out that there are 5 stages that I go through. The first stage, always assuming that I've already read the poem, is to produce a literal translation. There's no poetry in this version. It's literally just the words that convey the meaning of the original. Then for stage 2, I rewrite the whole thing. But this time I move things round and I change things to make it sound more English, to make it sound more natural in the English language. In translation, very often the first draft ends up being something that we call translationese. It's neither one language nor the other. It's all the words of the new language, but with the context and the syntax of the old language. And it doesn't really sound natural in the new language, which we call the target language. So I read through my first draft and I work out what can I do to make it sound more natural in English. Then for stage 3, I get my red pen out. Being a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to technology, I've gradually weaned myself off pen and paper for larger texts, but when I'm translating poetry, I still enjoy doing it on paper, at least in the first stages. So when I get to stage 3, I get the red pen out and I write all over my second draft. And this time, I'm concentrating on trying to make the poem sound more poetic. It's not just words now. I want to make it sound beautiful. I want it to have some kind of musical quality. I look back at the original and what features that has. Does it rhyme? Does it have a particular rhythm? Is there alliteration or any other aspects of language that make it beautiful, poetic and musical? Unfortunately, it's usually not possible to preserve every single aspect in a translation. It's very difficult to preserve the rhyme and the rhythm and all the other aspects of language without risking it sounding forced and not very nice. However, what I do find is that as I'm translating, I find new things that the language itself throws up at me in the new version. When I've done all that, I move on to stage 4, and in this stage, I write it out again in neat. Very often this is the stage where I transfer it to the computer. But as I'm writing out this new version, it usually involves tweaking and changing some more things along the way. And then the final stage, stage 5, involves reading it aloud. Poetry should sound nice when read aloud. And when you read it aloud, you notice more things than you might have seen when it was just on paper. So I read it aloud and I think, does it sound nice? Does it sound like poetry? And inevitably, there are more things to tweak and change along the way. It is, of course, tempting to keep going, changing things and adjusting things ad infinitum, but eventually, somewhere in this 5th stage, I have to tell myself, that's enough. time to stop, and time to share the poem with someone else. The poem that I've chosen to illustrate this process comes from French poet Charles Baudelaire's collection Les Fleurs du Mal. And because my theme at the moment is birds in literature, I've chosen his poem called The Albatross. It's a fairly short poem, it just has 4 verses of 4 lines each. So I'm going to show you the first verse in each stage of the process so that you can see how it's changed as I've gone along. So to begin with, let's take a look at the original. I do apologise for my French accent, but if you would like to hear the original read in a native French voice, there are many, many versions to choose from on the internet. So the first verse of the original goes like this. Souvent, pour s'amuser, les hommes d'équipage prennent des albatros, vastes oiseaux des mers, qui suivent, indolents compagnons de voyage, le navire glissant sur les gouffres amers. So it has 4 lines, it has a very regular rhythm to it, and lines 1 and 3, and lines 2 and 4 rhyme. For stage 1, I produced a very literal, very bold translation of the meaning of the words. Often, to amuse themselves, the men of the crew take albatrosses, vast birds of the seas, who follow, indolent companions on the voyage, the ship sliding over the bitter chasms. So it's not very poetic, it's not very beautiful, but you get the gist of what the poem is about. So then I had a go at a second version, moving a few things around, changing some words, changing some of the word order to make it sound a little bit nicer in English, but hopefully without changing the meaning. Often, to amuse themselves, the crewmen take down albatrosses, those huge birds of the seas, who, languid travelling companions that they are, follow the ship as it ploughs the bitter depths. So then, for stage 3, I took out my red pen and scribbled all over my second version. I decided I would try to keep the rhyming scheme, although you will find that some of my rhymes are not full rhymes, some of them are half rhymes, but it gives the poem some kind of structure. As for the rhythm, I decided not to follow the rhythm of the French words religiously because English words have a different rhythm. So I decided to let the English words fall into their own rhythm rather than trying to copy the rhythm of the original. And I also changed a few words and a little bit of word order here and there because it just sounded nicer that way. And then, of course, I read it out aloud and I played around with it and I changed a few things. And here is my final version of the full poem. The Albatross by Charles Baudelaire. Often the crewmen, just for amusement, take down albatrosses, those huge birds of the seas, travelling companions who, with languid movements, follow the ship as it ploughs the bitter deep. No sooner do they place them on the deck than, clumsy and shamefaced, these kings of the azure sky allow their great white wings to pitifully hang like oars by their sides. How the winged traveller becomes awkward and weak, once so fine, now comical and absurd. Someone jabs a clay pipe at his beak, another limps, mocking the flight of the wounded bird. The poet is like the prince of the clouds, frequenting the storm and scorning the archer. Grounded amidst jeering and shouts, gigantic wings prevent him from walking any further. So I hope you enjoyed listening to that rather sad poem. Needless to say, it being a very popular poem by a very popular poet, it has been translated many times, so I've added in the description below a link to some other versions by other translators so that you can compare them and see what you think. Which do you prefer? Do you have a preference for one over another or for different bits of one and different bits of another? Thank you very much for joining me on my journey through the process of translating a poem. In my next video, I'm going to work through another process, a slightly different process, but one that has many elements in common with this one. And that is writing a poem. Once again on the theme of birds, but hopefully this time a little bit more positive. I'm going to share with you a poem that I've written and explain how I did it. Once again, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And in the meantime, happy writing.